Hello, everybody. How are you tonight? Rookie mistake here. I don't know what happened exactly. Well, I do know exactly what happened. That's a lie. I thought I'd pressed the go live button. We've been speaking and chatting with all of you, getting your little hellos up on the screen. And then it was Lisa says, she says, has it started? Nothing is happening here. So Lisa, if I was wearing a hat, I'd be taking it off to you right now for alerting me to the fact that me pressing that button had made no difference. Sorry to all of you. Sorry to Richard, because he just said some very, very
Profound.
interesting things.
You mean the rambling? Yeah. We can start again.
Let's start. How are you, Richard?
I'm very well, thank you. What's your name again? Jamie, that's it. Yes, very well, thanks. Good evening,
lots
Chris
of
Fry.
Lots of people saying hello. We've got Lisa who saved us. We've got Chris there.
Thank
Hello,
you, Lisa.
Chris. Paola,
Paola.
Isabel. We've got
Hello.
Maria. We've got Sarah Norwich. Hello, Sarah Norwich.
Sarah Mav, hello.
Yes, you're friends, aren't you? We've got Lisa again. Juicy. Teacher. Are you good at pronouncing Greek names, Richard? That's not actually Greek. That's my eyesight. Maria Rosario. Yeah, I wish I had my glasses. And there's Phil and Lisa again. Lisa likes to get in 3 times, but we like that. and Nina. And we discussed Richard's just moved into a new flat. Tell us, and he's got some art on the walls, at least one piece of art on the wall. I'm assuming that's not the only piece of art you've got in your flat, is it, Richard?
No, it's not. But I mean, it's interesting because the last time we met, obviously, was for Lesson Stream, and it was we had a short informal meetup with some of the guys that might be here this evening. You said, and I just moved house that day and had no internet, and I was a little bit sweaty and exhausted, but it was lovely to chat to everyone online. But now I'm actually settled, and I'm very grateful to Sheila Thorne, who lent me her office, which is up the road from where I live in Walthamstow, that day to meet you online. And the painting behind me is a present from her that was painted by her dad. So I think it looks a bit odd with this light, but it's really quite a beautiful painting. So I've been very, very grateful to be given something so meaningful and personal.
Oh, how lovely. I wonder, I'm not the only one that thought that was a moon, but it's an artificial moon. It's been enhanced with an artificial moon by your lighting.
Somewhat.
Somewhat. Richard, we've been talking for 3 minutes, and you've not shown us your new book yet. Show us your new book.
I mean, normally it's seconds into a conversation. I've whipped it out of my bag and boring people to death about it. Well, thanks for coming along this evening. This is the book that I've co-written with my very good friend and colleague, Danny Norrington-Davies, who's a teacher, educator and trainer at International House London, and also works on the King's course that I work on the MAT Sol. And yes, this is our book, which we're going to be talking about this evening. It came out just over a month ago, and we're very excited about it.
And it's a book about gardening, if I'm not
mistaken. That's right. So it's basically it's a book about gardening, and as you can see here, we planted something, and it's emerging through the soil.
And that looks like cannabis to me. Cannabis, no doubt.
Yeah, you're not the first one to say that.
I did actually think that when I first saw it, but I don't know my cannabis plants that well. But tell us about the metaphor, the metaphor of why emergent language is associated with shoots and leaves and seedlings and plantlings and baby trees and the like.
Well, it's a funny one, really, because the book is published by, and I should probably definitely plug this, is published by Pavilion. Ooh. And they've got a great range of books if you haven't seen them. Emergent Gardening, Phil, exactly, that's it. And would have been a better title, Gardening in the Classroom, overdoing the metaphor maybe. And there's an image that all of their books have something of nature related to it. So they're kind of, I guess, looking at language and teaching and learning in a kind of organic way, which is very much the way that we think about emergent language, which we'll talk about a bit later. So the image that we've got on the front was one that something similar that I've been using for quite a while, because it's this idea of something starting off and growing and being in control of its own growth as well, and growing at its own pace. So that kind of organic metaphor really works with this idea of, our idea of what emergent language is. I say me and Danny, rather than the royal we.
And we had Scott Thornbury in as a guest in the Lesson Stream membership not so long ago. By the way, just one thing I should explain here. We had Richard in to do a guest webinar in the Lesson Stream membership just before Christmas. I forgot to press record, so that's why we got him back doing a live one for everybody. And yeah, we had Scott Thornbury in, and I hadn't realized it until quite recently that term, emergent language, he kind of coined it, didn't he? He was quick to remind me.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because when I was writing my master's, we do have a lot to thank Scott and Luke especially, but I think Scott who took this term, and it became very popular after this. But when I was writing my master's dissertation, which was on emergent language, I bothered him on Facebook. I think he's blocked me since. But anyway, I asked him, I couldn't find this term. It's not very popular online, in the literature. It doesn't really. It means something else actually in child development of language. And there's emerging language, and in IH we often talk about emerging language, the gerund form being the idea that it's got more process to it. So there are lots of these, I was trying to work out where this term came from, and obviously, it starts to become popular when dogma was first talked about, which is kind of later known as teaching unplugged. But Scott got back to me at the time and said, well, I'd have to look up exactly where that term came from. But certainly he spoke at the International House Conference recently, and he definitely claimed the term. And it's really nice to hear that and it was the source that I found. The earliest mention of emergent language is an article that he wrote, and I think in about 2000, if I'm not right, it might be 1999. So around about that time. So it kind of dates back to then, but the term embodies some other ideas of language teaching. So, maybe let's just talk about what Danny and I are defining it as.
Well, I was going to say, why? Because why don't we ask everybody if they could give their own, how they understand the term, what to mean, and I can give you what I take it to mean as well, and then you can give us yours. Because it doesn't seem to be. There doesn't seem to be a concrete definition of what it is.
Not to date.
And I do.
Yeah, not to date. And I think that's a really good point, because one of the reasons we wrote the book was because it can mean all manner of things to all manner of people, if that phrase works. So I think it's quite an interesting thing. I have done this before with teachers, to write down, what do you think it means? So if people want to type into the chat, let's have a look, and we can compare together what we think it is.
What does it mean to you? What is emergent language or emerging language to you? How do you understand that term? And you could put it into practical terms as well, which I think is one of the things about it. It's based in theory, but when I think of emergent language or emerging language, I think of very practical stuff going on in the classroom. And I suppose if I'm going to give my own sort of working definition of it, it's language comes from students, usually in a sort of unplanned way, but I would say it often comes out of activities that I've designed or prepared, and therefore I've kind of maybe preempted it, but maybe that's not how you see it. But I also I've always very, very much associated emerging or emergent language with the blackboard or the whiteboard. At the end of your class, the language that's on the board that came from your students that wasn't planned, that would be a great sort of visual representation of what emergent language is in my idea, in my sort of mind. So we've got Lisa says language that comes up through conversation. Nina says what students come with, what emerges in conversation. Chris, something some students need help with during an activity. Julie is learning English based on what real life situations students are encountering. So how do you then define it? How do you and Danny define it, Richard, in your book?
I'll tell you what, I'll read you our definition, because everything everyone said and what you said is included in what we're talking about. But let's just have a look at it took quite a long time actually to really define what we meant by emergent language. So this is what we came up with eventually. Scott's definition that he presented at the IH conference is slightly different. We won't go into that one today, but this is what we settled on, and trialing it with different tutors and teachers and trainers that we work with. And we say that emergent language is unplanned language that is needed or provided by learners during meaning-focused interactions. Yeah, so it's language that is needed or produced, sorry, by learners during meaning-focused interactions. The language is then explored through reformulation, clarification, and support from the teacher. So the kind of key things there that people are coming up with, it's unplanned. It's different to target language, where target language, we're setting out to teach the present perfect or that second conditional that day in that lesson. Emergent language is when the learners are trying to communicate on meaning-focused activities, when they're trying to say something meaningful rather than doing, like, say, a grammar drill, which isn't meaning-focused. Yeah, that would be form-focused. It's when there's some sort of real communication happening and there's a need for language. That language could come from the teacher working with that, but it's not necessarily that. It could be something comes up from the learners, and it becomes interesting in the lesson. You know, I remember some of the early things, looking at an early blog post of some of the proponents of dogma, like my very good friend and colleague Chia Swan Chong, who did a blog post many years ago, and it focuses mostly on error. Interestingly, I think she'd probably look at it very differently now, and we can talk about a conversation we had together about it included interactive skills as well, interactional skills rather. So it's not just error correction when learners say something wrong, but it could be that, but it's really when an error happens and it's getting in the way of communication, or somebody's just written in the chat, when there's a gap, the learner gets to the help me teacher, and the teacher can supply language that's important to the learner to help them say what they want to say. It could be when the learner gives you a translation, the teacher reformulates it for you. And I think what you said about the board, Jamie, or it could be the online whiteboard, I use a Google Doc online, putting the language up and making it explicit, I think, is key in our definition to the learners. Yeah. So, you know, because lots of things that happen when we're reformulating what learners say. A learner might say something and I might recast it. I go there at the weekend. Oh, you went there at the weekend. And I might want to keep the conversation going. That is a reformulation, but it's not necessarily as explicit as it would be if you put it on, you stop the class and you focus then on the form of language. And then we go back to meaning afterwards. So it could be that, but it's also, there's a few more bits to it that are important to mention. It could be errors through communicative breakdowns or gaps in the learner's knowledge. It could be, for example, you know, when you teach like intermediate learners or upper intermediate or advanced learners, and you think, well, they've said it quite clearly, it's not quite right, but what's the point in changing it? The meaning's quite clear. But you think, okay, well, these learners are here in class and they need to be pushed on developmentally. So what we might take is a learner utterance, and then we might, some people have used the term upgrade, but we would use the term of providing an alternative, a more complex way of saying the same thing, so we can push them on developmentally. You know, at lower levels, everything's emergent, isn't it? You know, you're constantly feeding in and helping learners and supporting them what they're saying and scaffolding their output. And just the last two, you know, it's when a student says to you, teacher, how do I say? Or what's this in English? That's also emergent language. You know, and research suggests that actually there's a lot of uptake. Learners start using the things that they want to know about, and it makes a lot of sense, that. But it could also be, you know, a learner could mention something in class, bring something up, language up in class that the other learners don't know. And therefore that becomes emergent language as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to come from the teacher or the teacher noticing that the learners need help with language from a task or an activity. It could actually come from the learners themselves as well.
And so, yes, if our learner asks that question, how do you say this in English? Again, it's sort of going back to the idea that Victoria mentioned. It's a gap, isn't it? Demonstrating a gap to be filled. And you mentioned that you differentiate, or you don't use the word upgrade, but you tend to use alternative way of expressing it. Did you say? What makes you kind of avoid that word upgrade?
Yeah,
I've heard that a few times.
Yeah, it's one that I've personally used, and it comes very much from Demand High. So the idea, Adrian Underhill and Jim Scrivener's idea of pushing the learners rather than just accepting what they say, pushing the learners beyond what they can already do. A lot of the examples I kind of looked at from that, we looked at rather, seem to be more focused on error correction. But the term, I mean, if the metaphor works for you, I once asked Adrian Underhill what it's from, and it's they got the idea of being upgraded on an airplane into a better way of doing something. But we thought it kind of feels a bit deficit to say that something is better. So we looked at things like a more complex or an alternative way of saying something. One of the early writers that doesn't use the term emergent language, but he used the term to help the learner say something in a more efficacious sense. So we decided not to use that word and go for alternative or complex.
But I rather like the word upgrade, though, and I think maybe the teacher does have we can actually have confidence in ourselves and be able to provide that very thing. And it is kind of in disguise. An upgrade is something people like. I don't actually think of airplanes. I think more of people giving me something, upselling, I suppose, but it could be airplanes. Yeah.
I think, it's picking whatever metaphor works for you. The basic thing is, how are you helping the learners developmentally from where they're at? And the key thing with the emergent language and where it differs from target language is that you're not working with the syllabus necessarily. It's the grammatical syllabus that we often find in a course book. You're working with what the learners actually really want to say there and then. Yeah. So I think that's kind of the difference for me with that. Yeah.
You mentioned, you've talked about emergent language with lower levels and higher levels, and that is quite interesting. Have you experienced a sort of idea that it's difficult to use emergent language with beginners, whereas in fact I've found that when you're working with beginners, that's exactly,
it's all emergent. Everything that happens is
I remember.
Well, not necessarily. Obviously, you might have your target structures or your functional chunks that you're trying to teach them, or your adjacency pairs. Yeah. No, I mean, we write about this in the books. The books, I'll start and explain a little bit more. So the book's divided into two main sections, and the first section is kind of looking at what is emergent language as we're kind of fleshing out now, and then we talk about how it fits into a lesson. Then we talk about how teachers work in terms of classroom interaction with learner output. And then in the second half, we've got some practical activities that teachers can use to help them develop their reactive skills, because this is something maybe we can spend a bit of time talking about in a minute, but teachers have a lot of issues with what you were describing before, Jamie, of dealing with something on the spot. It might seem quite intuitive when you're an experienced teacher, or if you're very confident with your context.
Well, actually, I think I think it's a very difficult thing for all teachers, and I know for a fact that I'm a bit out of practice. When I go back into teaching, as I do sometimes, especially in the summertime, it's the one thing I'm going, oh God, and so I wouldn't want anyone to think that it's something I'm really good at. It's the one thing. Do you find the same? Do you have the same experience?
Absolutely. And, I've been teaching for nearly 20 years, so like yourself, a long time. And I've spent a lot of time in the training room watching people teach. And I've also done Celta and Delta courses. I noticed Claudia, one of my former Deltees, is online saying hi. Hello, Claudia. But I think, for me, I've spent a lot of time working on being better at responding to what learners say. And it was actually not so long ago, before the book, but probably about 6 or 7, I can't remember, years ago, Nick Andon at King's College kicked off a project, King's College London kicked off a project that Danny got involved in and I got involved in, which was basically trying to work out what's happening in the interaction between teachers and learners. So looking at the types of way that we deal with what comes up, and experienced expert teachers, what do we do? And it was actually looking at that made me start questioning some of the things that I do, not necessarily in a negative way, but just asking myself, why do I do that? For example, I noticed that I make things, when a learner says something and it comes up in class, I kind of stop and I say, okay, hang on, let's look at what you just said. Let's put this on the board. Now let's look at this. And we'll spend a bit of time working with it. And I hadn't really realized that I was doing that. And I hadn't really thought about the principle of why I was doing that. And the reason was, by kind of talking about it with Danny and thinking about it myself, is that, I believe it's important to make things salient and clear for the learners when you're working on language. I'll give you an example of that today, because emergent language isn't only in the classroom. It's a natural process for anyone who's ever learned a language. Today, I spent a bit of the afternoon speaking Spanish with my partner. My Spanish is like kind of B2 on a very good day, more kind of to the B1 end of things. And it just got me thinking about, there was a phrase that he said that I had to slow him down and say, hang on, how many words are you saying? Say it slowly for me. And I had to really concentrate on the form of the language. And I'm not saying I'm going to get that straight away, but I'm more aware of it if it's explicit. So I had to ask myself why I believe this was important to do in the classroom. So I'd say for all of us as teachers, there's always something to learn by actually looking at the interaction that we have with learners in the classroom. I noticed I echo a bit more than I thought I do. I often tell people off for echoing when I'm watching on the side.
Yeah. Is this something you've become aware of through filming yourself by any chance?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, we've provided activities which are simple things like maybe just recording a bit of classroom interaction. For example, a bit of feedback, recording it on your phone, and then going back and listening to it. It can, 30 seconds can actually give you quite a bit of if you look at a few turns, a minute can give you loads of information. It doesn't have to be looking at a whole lesson. If you've got the video, it's even better. But we can certainly start to look at what we're doing with language. Are we just I remember looking at this about 12, 13 years ago. I noticed I gave a lot of oral feedback, but I wasn't actually writing it on the board, which wasn't very helpful for the learners and in terms of them recording language and helping them go away and do some memory work afterwards. So I think it's really important to examine what we do in class, because then we get better at doing it ourselves and we become more aware of our choices that we have when we're working in interactional moments in class.
I've just, in the most recent post in the lesson stream story course, which has been unlocked this weekend, it's all about asking questions. And I mention stuff that I've learned about myself through filming. You can get quite shocked sometimes. I've seen myself. Well, there's what I mentioned specifically in the most recent post is, this is in the context of a story. So you're telling your students a very short story, and you've got a few questions maybe before the story, some questions after the story, maybe even got a question or two during the story, depending. And so you've got this, you're telling a story, and you've got the narrative in your head, your own comprehension, your own interpretation, your own experience of the story. So sometimes you ask a question and the answer you get back is very different to the one you expected. And rather than kind of embrace it and go, wow, that's interesting, you panic inside, and you might adopt, this is something that won't come through the audio, but you adopt a very negative and almost defensive body language, and you can see that you're panicking inside, and you maybe brush over the answer that you get back from the student. You maybe move on too quickly. You don't give it the attention that maybe it was merited. And I was thinking, how did that poor student feel at that moment? And I may, I'm probably being too hard on myself here, but that's the nature of the beast when you're being overly critical of yourself, when you're watching yourself. And this is very connected with this emergent language, because this is the difficulty of asking questions. I think this entire dynamic of knowing when to ask a question, knowing how to ask a good question, knowing how to deal naturally with the response you get, and then working with that response is at the absolute, the fundamental of what it is to be a language teacher. And it's very, very difficult. Maybe that will put some teachers off filming themselves.
Yeah, let's I'm just really interested. I think it's a really honest observation, and it's so true, isn't it? And this is something I've noticed as well. And, you know, again, it's great for me very often because I'm sitting on the sidelines very often watching people on Celta Delta teach. And, you know, I've got the luxury of being able to note down what's happening when they're trying to do 1,000,001 things at the time. For example, follow their lesson plan, which is like having the narrative in your head, having your story. And in a way, you're second guessing the learners. So the questions that you're asking is fascinating, isn't it? The questions that you're asking aren't genuine questions. They're not what we call referential questions. They're display questions. You're asking the learners to guess what's in your head and come up with a particular response that you've decided on. And I think we do that. You know, I've certainly been guilty of this, trying to work with emergent language. I'm trying to elicit actually where I want it to go rather than actually working with what's really happening. So it's a really fine line between what's really emergent and what's being controlled by the teacher. And you're right about the questions, because questions are a real feature, you know, are a very common feature of, you know, they're not necessarily in conversation in general, but in class, teachers ask lots of questions. But I would say one thing I've become very aware of are the type of questions that I'm asking. You know, what's actually going to bring out real genuine communication, or am I controlling the discourse? Because as teachers we are control freaks, because, you know, that's the role that we're putting, the authority position in the classroom, which I'm not saying we can remove entirely, because you can't. At the end of the day, when I call everyone's attention back, hopefully, unless you've got a very rowdy class that's not listening to you, they're gonna you've got the power to pull the discourse back. So I think that's something to consider. I think you're absolutely right, the kind of question that you ask, you know, and where do we allow a space because it's not going the way I wanted it to. Again, back to Adrian Underhill, who's got a lot to say about this kind of thing. You know, he talked about recently. I watched a really good talk that he did for IH on improvisation in the classroom, and I think what we forget as teachers, and we don't talk about this enough in the book actually, but it's at the heart of it, is teaching is skilled improvisation. You know, if you plan a lesson, this is what Adrian said, and I like this explanation. If you plan the lesson the night before or the morning before, you know, however long it is before you teach, you can't account for exactly what the students are going to do. There's an element of the students might not do what you want them to do. You know, they might have an issue that you didn't anticipate. You know, we spend a lot of time on training courses getting learners to anticipate learners' problems. Well, you know, you need enough experience to be able to anticipate those kinds of things when you're considering your material. But I like this idea of skilled improvisation. It is, and from the beginning, all teachers, whether you're a novice teacher, you're having to improvise, because that's the nature of teaching itself. Yeah, if you control the discourse so tightly that you follow your plan exactly, and the learners do exactly what you want them to do, I think that's not actually, there's no room in there for actual learning, because the learning happens in the space where it becomes messy. It happens in the interaction. It happens when the learners are unsure and you're working with the learners in order to help them understand that, whether that's target language or whether that's emergent language. So I think that's something we need to consider, this idea of improvisation. But therefore, if it is improvisation from the beginning, as teachers, we need to examine where, you know, how do I get better at improvising those bits? It might be getting better at my language awareness. It might be, you know, maybe it's taking a picture of your board. As you say, all the language goes up on the board for you, Jamie, in class. Same with me. I take a picture of my board and I have a look at what language came up. Did I only write single words down? You know, did I only write, you know, did I write the whole lexical chunk? Did I give them an example that they can write in their books and take away? Because there's that moment in class when you put emergent language up on the board. We call them, I think Melissa Lamb, who you know, Mel, my colleague, who we met in Birmingham many years ago, she calls them notebook moments. And you notice all of the learners suddenly go and start writing down the stuff that's going on the board because it's of immediate interest to them. Yeah. So I think these are things that we can consider. You know, what's the role of improvisation? How do I get better at improvising? Well, I've got to become more aware of what I do in class. And you do a lot of stand-up. Do you do any improvisation as well, Jamie?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. Yes, I'm halfway through my first ever improv. I don't know if you call it I still don't know if you call it impro or improv, but you don't call it improvisation. Here in Barcelona, there's a group, an improv company, and I know quite a few teachers who do it, and I love it. It's so much fun, and I I don't have enough experience to say this yet, but I suspect it genuinely could be quite useful for teachers along exactly the lines that you're talking about here, Richard.
I've got a quick question for you with that one though. So in your improv, is it all just expecting you from nothing to come up with something, or are you given a scenario, or are you given something to work with, or a complication, or?
Well, there's lots of ways to answer that. It depends on what you're doing. But for me, the best types of I don't even know what we call them yet. Formats. The best type of format is when both of you, if that is that you're doing it in a pair, and sometimes you do it in threes or fours, but both of you have to be absolutely reactive to each other, and you can only achieve success through genuinely listening. And so you have to let go. You have to let go of your kind of plans and your preconceived ideas of where you want the story. And there's always a story where you want it to go, and just listen and react. And then your partner does the same. And yeah, there's so many different formats here. It's difficult to have an across the board answer, but that's what I like best, when it's just listening and reacting.
You've got something to work with, and then obviously, but I think it's really key what you're saying about listening, because this is something we talk about in the book, and it's about it's quite difficult. I went back to the classroom after pandemic, and I was teaching. Everyone was off with COVID, and I was teaching a class of intermediate learners. And there are about 15 of them, and they were really rowdy. International House London, people from all over the world, quite a young bunch. Lots of energy, and I really, I'm quite good at tuning in, and I found it really hard to tune into what they were saying, and until you can tune into what they're really meaning to each other. So back to this focus on meaning. What are they really saying to each other? Then you actually can't work with any emergent language, because if not, you're just trying to snatch language, grasp at language and put it on the board, and it's not very meaningful. So I had to give myself the advice that we'd written in the book, which was stop. Go and stand next to a pair for at least a minute or two. Don't go anywhere else. Tune everyone else out and just tune in to what they're saying. And I got my notebook and started writing down what they're talking about, rather than writing down any errors or gaps at this moment. And when I tuned in, then I started to note down a couple of things that they were saying related to the topics that I'd made notes of. And that's the way I think teachers can train themselves, or at least support working with emergent language and feedback. You're still improvising because it's coming up in the moment, but you're kind of supporting that improvisation by by helping your working memory, by making some notes that you can then use in feedback. Because I don't know how you find it, but I really find it hard to keep all that information in my head. I forget very quickly. So I find myself writing things down quite a lot to support that feedback. But I think, as you said, listening is key.
Well, I wonder if you have the same sort of experience, that as a newly qualified, if I could ever call myself qualified 20 years ago, but as a newbie teacher, when I just
experience
as an inexperienced teacher 20 years
well
ago.
Seasoned.
No, this is 20 years ago, 2002.
Oh, sorry.
And I just when I just finished my my cert TESOL and started teaching, and I'd be listening in. Actually, a lot of what I did was one-to-ones, and it would be there'd be most of the focus is on the form. There's not much focus on the meaning, and so you've got your kind of a little bit thinking about what your student's saying or trying to say, but it's the grammar mistakes, the obvious bumps in the carpet, aren't they? You can see them clearly, and they're the ones that have to be corrected. Those are the ones that have to be flattened. The extent where the whole thing becomes incredibly systematic and boring. It's all about third person singular S's,
yes.
or missed out past. But then
exactly.
Then with the experience that we get under our belt, you start to become very more focused on the meaning and what your students are saying, and you start listening to them, and all those sort of grammar little details become boring and almost sometimes become invisible, or you become deaf to, because you're tired of listening out for them, and so you sometimes your learners could say stuff that really could benefit from your input, but you miss those opportunities. I find this a lot, and you've got to go back. And I think this is what I'm thinking when you're saying to go back with your notebook and to find a sort of happy medium. And it's, for me, it's not about third person singular S's. It's about much more deeper stuff than that. And I know we've spoken about feedback as well, and this is a very important part of what we're talking about. You know, corrections are about so much more than just grammar corrections. And if we're not only just focusing on corrections here, we're talking, in fact, could we just do a little thing here, Richard? Well, you don't know what I'm going to suggest here, but
no, I'm letting it emerge.
There's where is this? Is it this one here? Yeah, I'm just going to put it. This is an example of I've used this before in one of my courses, and I'm going to give everybody here a task. I'm going to show you an utterance that came from a student. You will see instantly what we were doing when the student in question came out with this utterance, okay? And what your task is to put into the chat how you would reformulate, how you would, if you want to use the word upgrade, how you would correct, because correction is needed here. How would you reformulate this utterance? And I want you to type in your answer into the chat, but don't type it until I say 1, 2, 3, push the button, and then they should all come at the same time, okay? How does that sound? Richard, you can just sit there and look at this sagely, all right? But,
in case I don't know the answer. And you have to correct me. It'd be a bit embarrassing. No, fine. I don't know.
So the utterance of the day is, it says, oops. Let's just see here. Oh, add to stream. That's it. Okay. The student in question said, if I win the lottery, I would to travel in lots of countries of the world. Now, don't press return yet, but do type in how you would reformulate this utterance that you see in front of you. And in a moment, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, hit return, and all of these answers are going to come up together. So if I win the lottery, I would to travel in lots of countries of the world. This is either an actual thing a student once said, or it's based on a real thing that a student once said. It doesn't actually matter, because I've used this and a number of others. In fact, Richard, I've seen you do the same. That when the time we met in 2014, I came to a workshop of yours on emergent language. You had a whole bunch of this type of thing, and you invited us to offer our own feedback as if we were teachers. Okay, ready, everybody? 1, 2, 3, press return. One thing you should know, Richard, there's a 10-second delay between us speaking and us and the participants hearing us. So it'll take 10 seconds for these to appear. So let's not panic. Let's not panic. So let's see. By my accounts, okay, if I won the lottery, I would travel to lots of countries in the world. If I win the lottery, I will travel to lots of countries of the world. If I won the lottery, I would travel to lots of countries in the world. If I won the lottery, I would be able to travel to lots of countries around the world. I should be just going up here. So there we go. Lots of countries, travel all over the world. Hands Up Project. Hello there.
Hey, hello, Hands Up Project.
I wonder who's representing Hands Up Project there. So in my experience, and this happens time and time again, I've kind of added so many grammatical problems there with the if I win. It's got to be consistent. We expect it as teachers. We expect to be, if I win the lottery, I will. If the student thinks, which they probably wouldn't. So it's probably going to be hypothetical. If I won the lottery, I would. I would travel, and there's an in rather to the to. And this is what the teachers tend to focus on. But Alan's being said, which countries would you travel to? A nice a nice alternative there. And so Lisa's got, I would travel around the world. Yes. And my what I was thinking was there's often tendency to focus on the grammar, but less tendency to focus on the lexis. And for me, I would argue that the lexical part that requires upgrading or feedback is the last part. To travel to lots of countries in the world, there's a great opportunity for an upgrade here. And that is something I think Lisa said. She said, I think I saw travel around the world, or I would offer just travel the world as per Annie Lennox in Eurythmics, Sweet Dreams. Remember, I'd travel the world and the seven seas. I mean, travel the world is a very, it seems to be quite a high frequency collocation. I had a little check on the English vocabulary profile, and it's actually included as part of the collocations with the verb travel at A1. So I don't know what we think of that collocation, to travel the world, but I don't know what you think of this. It does seem to me to kind of illustrate the point that as teachers, we can be blinded by the grammatical problems to the actual potential for working with the lexical issues. What do you think of that, Richard?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, I think a lot of, I think certainly, my generation of language teacher, probably the same as you, Keddy, and Jamie Keddy, and Danny. Keddy, Danny became Keddy then. So
call me
you, Danny, Keddy. So Keddy. So I think, our generation of language teachers, very much, obviously we're, very much situated in the communicative approach to language teaching, but very much informed by, the later stages of that, which was, the lexical approach, which is very influential in the way that we teach. So I think that, certainly our approach to emergent language is often very lexical, because the more that we've learned about grammar is that the grammar is often generated by the lexis anyway. So, think if you're doing kind of some sort of grammaring activity where you get the learners to add grammar to lexis, that kind of thing is very emergent as well. So I totally agree. I mean, I'd start with lexis and, see what happens. But it can, emergent language can be any part of the language system. It could be lexical, which I generally find is out of communication, because that's what people often need, things to be able to say, and the grammar doesn't seem as important. Or grammar if we're looking at nuance of meaning. And also, the obvious one is pronunciation. But the other bit of emergent language, which I think which we do include in the book, which I think a lot of people don't think of in terms of the language system, is moving beyond just the grammar, lexis, and phonology, and moving beyond that and looking at how that works in discourse. And then also maybe in terms of interaction, because something that you might help learners with is interactional rather than lexical. Let me give you an example. So I had, for example, watching a CELTA class, pre-intermediate class, a little while ago, and a student said something really sexist. And the other students in the class didn't like it. The Turkish girl who was sitting next to him was really angry, and but they play in a kind of playful way. They were putting him in his place, but what they were struggling to be able to do, because this went on and on and on, I kept out of it. But the students all kind of jumped on what he'd said, but what they weren't able to do by the time this was going on and on, they weren't able to stop it or mediate this interaction. They weren't able to say, right, let's just agree to disagree and move on. Yeah, right. We hear what you're saying, but we don't agree. They didn't have any of these lexical items in order to sort out the problem in the interaction. So I think this is also what we've got to think about emergent language as well. It's not just giving them, nouns or collocations or chunks. It's actually going beyond that and looking about what do these chunks do in terms of in terms of interaction, and how do we upgrade, if we're not going to use that phrase, or how do we make them more effective in these interactional moments.
It's a really nice way to put it. Yes, and also when you started talking there, I thought you were going to move on to another thing, which we've been speaking up until now, and there's of course possibilities for writing, which you've got a lot of ideas for in the book. That's a nice way how to manage what's going on in the classroom with the functional phrases and discourse. And there's also, I wanted to get you to comment on this lovely text, Richard. Is this in your book?
It's not in the book actually, but this is something I observed, and it was the beginning of a class, and again, the same pre-intermediate, was it the same pre-intermediate class? I did consecutive CELTAs where it was the same group, and they were just brilliant. This group of students, I was lucky enough to be able to teach them as well, and I was watching and this is Delta, sorry, and I was watching a teacher, and at the beginning of the class, she starts the class by saying, you know, oh hi everyone, yeah, what did you do this morning? How are you? You know, what did you do this morning? And a student, a quite low level student, excuse me, I think he was Estonian, I think, and he turned around and said, I water the flowers, which is actually, it's an interesting sentence in itself, because water, I mean, quite a complex verb to use, but what she didn't do was to jump on, well, you're supposed to use water in the past tense. What's the past tense of water? How do we make it a regular verb? She didn't do any of that. Back to your point, Jamie, about actually, it's pretty complex what this pre-intermediate learner said him, you know, where did that come from? Who knows? I mean, it's an odd thing to say water all morning. And then, you know, the teacher said, you have a garden. So the teacher asked a real genuine question to the learner. The learner, she didn't say, you know, what's the past of watered? And the student said, no garden, no garden. And you can see it in the corner over here. He's trying to say, student tries to help out. Balcony? Oh, do you have a balcony? The teacher picks up on the other learner utterance. So it's happening in the group. It's co-constructed through the group. What the meaning is. No balcony, and she said, oh, is it this? And went over to the computer and Googled window box. Now, you would never teach the term window, the phrase, the noun window box, would you? You know, you'd never teach this concrete noun, because why would you? Why would you ever see it in a course book? Because it's very low frequency. But in that moment, the learner wanted to know it. So, you know, working with emergent language, we've got some interesting things here where the teacher is using genuine questions that help the teacher get to helping the learner what they actually want to say. And I think that's what's really powerful about emergent language. It's giving the learner agency to say what they want to say. Obviously, we've got to check that what we're reformulating is really what the learner wants to say, because there's a danger of giving them something that they don't want, you don't want to say. Yeah.
But it's a lovely compound noun window box, isn't it? Two incredibly high frequency words brought together to create a personal part of something that's very personal to a student's life in this case. And so I think nice.
We got a choice when we provide feedback. And in the spur of the moment, it's difficult, and you know, that's why when learners are busy, it's quite nice to be able to note things down and revisit them and say, you know, Julia, you know, you were talking about this. Can you tell us more about this? Right, I heard this as you were saying this. Let's have a look at this. So we switch from meaning to form, back to meaning.
Well, we have to bring Alan's comment here when he mentioned, you know, when I asked that question, what would your reformulation be? And Alan's, I don't know if that's how I asked the question. How would you deal with this? And Alan said, what countries would you travel to? So very meaning focused, which is lovely. But yeah, what you're saying here, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. You can keep going with working with the whole meaning of what the learner's talking about, and then come back to the form afterwards. Of course, the older you get, the more difficult it might be to do that, because short-term memory goes.
I mean, there's an argument, you know, the academics kind of would say that, you know, interactionists would say that, you know, you should deal with it there in the moment. Because it's more memorable, and there's a real good argument for that. However, practically speaking, in class, when learners are busy, you don't often want to slow down, you know, take them off task. However, when we're all together in feedback, if you're feeling confident as a teacher, then things will emerge, and everybody's attention is on that language when you take it out to inspect it. You know, it could be a case that, you know, as Alan's example was a communicative recast, where we want to keep the conversation going, and we've modeled the language for them. That language can often be missed by the learners, depending on the level. If they're higher level learners, they might notice the recast. Lower level learners don't so much. So we might recast it and then make it more salient on the board for the learners.
And there's a little marker that I've used a lot, and this is something I started doing as a teacher, and has become, let me call this, a life skill.
Do tell. I think I might need it.
Well, I've never been the best listener, and I think becoming a teacher allowed me to improve considerably. And one thing that you do when you have to, or when you want to, let's say there's no have to, when you want to stop a student or interrupt them, even to offer some kind of feedback on the form or the pronunciation, whatever, you can once you've offered whatever it is you're going to offer, get them back online by saying, anyway, you said that you watered your garden, or anyway, you said that if you won the lottery, you would travel to lots, you would travel the world. Remember, travel the world, but where would you like to go specifically? What countries? And when you use that well, you can see not just students, but people, they really appreciate that. When you put them back on track after any kind of interruption, whether it was one that you instigated or otherwise, people tend to really like that, because it's showing that you've been listening to them, and it shows that you want to know what they were saying. And in more cases than not, they will very happily take the bait and continue to move with whatever it is that they were talking about.
There's a couple of interesting points in there, and I think it's, first thing is, what do learners expect when they come to class? Now, it's difficult to say all learners, because every context is going to be different, and emergent language will work differently if you're working in a classroom with 20 to 100 students in Senegal, which we explore in the last part of the book. We look at emergent language in different contexts. Or if you've got a group of young learners, who are like 7 or 8 year olds, or you've got some teenagers, or you've got an exam class. So it will be different in every context. But very often, certainly in the context I work in, the learners they want to be listened to, and actually by responding to emergent language and things that they've said do show that you're listening to them, as well as responding to meaning and the content of what they're saying, actually responding and giving them some help with the language that they're saying. Learners often appreciate it if you take it as, you said something interesting, let's look at that. Okay, there's another way to do that, let's have a look at this. So I think the way that you deal with it's important, but you're right, the switching back to meaning is really important. But I think one important thing to consider as well is, just because it's gone up on the board and they might have noted it down in their notebooks, doesn't mean that they're going to learn it. Because as we all know, as language learners, like this phrase that I was trying to learn earlier on today, I'm going to have to go back and study it again because I can't remember. I've got the lexical chunk bits in it, but I still can't remember what the collocation was, and I haven't been able to grammar it. So I'm going to have to go back and look at that particular phrase. And it was basically, you can probably help me, Jamie. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. In Spanish is te doy el mano. Coge el brazo, is that right?
I think it might be, but I'm not confident with that.
But I wasn't sure with the grammar, so I've got to go back and study that again. So I think what we've got to think about with emergent languages work is the feedback to feed forward. So a couple of things you can think about doing with that is, when it's up on the board, do a memory test with it. I always say to my learners the next day, right, choose 5 of the phrases that we looked at in today's session that went up on the board in the useful language section, which is the emergent language section, and practice them this evening. Write some examples that are meaningful for you, and then I get them to come back into class the next day and test each other. But one of the key things I think is important to do to go back to meaning is to say, what were we talking about when this language went up on the board? When this language came up, what were we talking about? So returning to meaning is really important for that language to not be just chunks without any pineapple. I think Scott Thorpe describes it as. It's actually, those chunks become meaningful in context.
Yes. Well, it's funny because after going back to my own teaching that 20 years ago, I say 20 years ago, it's probably more like 22. Oof. I actually, after starting to learn about what it was all about, I think I became slightly addicted to emergent language. Richard, have you ever heard anyone say that before?
Yes,
addicted to emergent language.
I don't know if it's a strong collocation, but the more we use it, the stronger it'll get, Jamie. I think that's the thing.
I went too far. Let me show you, because let me show you. I went before we met today. I went back because I've got all of my notes from those days, and I was able to go into every single class I had, or every single student I had. I would have a folder full of files, and everything that was in it was stuff like this. And what you see in front of you comes from a class I remember I had for years. There was 5 of us. There was 4 of them. They were all hotel managers, and we'd meet once or twice a week for years. And I was always aware of trying to get stuff that they said and get it on the board and create a context. As you can see here, the standard unit is the sentence. And so all of what you see here, I think, is stuff that came out of my students. And almost when I say I became addicted, I think the detrimental aspect of this is that I saw what you see in front of you almost as a sort of currency. And I became so invested in getting stuff like this out of my students that I was focusing on that rather than the actual communication happening at the time. But there's so much you can do with this. In the beginning of every class, I mean, you mentioned, Richard, your idea was to go back over what were we saying, refine the context. There's so much you can do here. You can say, who said this? So one of the things I would do is start with a dictation where I would dictate, 8 of these lines, and they would have to remember not necessarily what was happening when it was said, but more specifically, who said it.
Nice.
In other cases, there was a natural question. It was difficult to give them all away. The natural question there would be, what? Difficult to give what all away? And it was Maribel been talking about her cat that had given birth to kittens. They couldn't get rid of their kittens, so they'd keep 4 of them or some ridiculous thing like that. Pedometers are for counting steps, not farts, which was a particularly memorable one. Does your Spanish get that?
It doesn't, but I mean, there's a lot around that particular word. Lots of phrases around that one I'm noticing.
A Spanish for a fart is un pedo.
Pedo.
So a pedometer.
Yeah. And estoy en pedo. It means I'm kind of lost in my own thoughts, doesn't it? I think.
Exactly. Estoy pedo means I'm very, very drunk.
Oh, does it as well? Yeah. It's got a lot of functions.
Yes, but there's L2, L1, L2 translations. Take half a dozen of these lines, translate them into Spanish, remove the English ones, then translate them back into English. And there's a tendency for teachers to assume that these kind of techniques, whether it's translation, whether it's kind of dictation in this case, are not meaningful. But this has the source of something which is absolutely meaningful and very personalized. And so what you're dictating here, if that's what we're looking at, is actually it's student generated. It's so I think, as I say, I went too far, but there's a lot. I think this is still a type of format that I still use a lot when I'm teaching, and that's usually these days in Norwich.
It's really interesting, Jamie. I think, I totally agree with you. I mean, I remember about 12 years ago, and I remember at the time because I was quite new at IH, and I kind of went deep end. I was working with Chia, and we were going very, very into dogma. We're that generation, obviously, and we got really, really deep into doing completely emergent. And unfortunately, I don't think my reactive skills were quite in tune enough, tuned enough, and honed enough to be able to impress the particular upper intermediate class I had, which I covered the board in stuff through the lesson and not in a very systematic way. And they all complained they wanted to use the course book. So I think I totally get where you're coming from with going too far. And I think what I've learned is it's not to be sort of dogmatic, pardon the pun, about what we do in the classroom. If you are using the course book, then it's looking for moments that you can use as a springboard to work with emergent language. And it's what one writer, Allwright, calls learning opportunities, or what Van Leer calls affordances, these moments in class where something comes up that you can work with in terms of learn a language. And it's allowing the space in the lesson plan for that to happen, I think. So they can coexist quite well, target language and emergent language. And actually target language can springboard into emergent language quite easily as soon as the students start having questions about something that you're looking at. And that's when the lines become a bit blurred between these two terms. But I think the key thing is allowing space for things to really organically happen in a lesson. That's the key thing for me.
I've identified the Hands Up project as being Nick.
Hi,
and he's
Nick.
got a nice question there. Put it on the screen. Nick's asking us, what's your top tip for making emergent language stick? And you actually mentioned, Nick, during when you did this session or a similar one, you mentioned, Nick, an activity that Nick had taught you, which...
Well, I think the first time I probably heard the term emergent language was from Nick when I worked with him, which is probably nearly 20 years ago in Birmingham at Brass House Language Centre. And I think there are so many things. And there's a very good book by Nick, by the way, here we go, plug, but called Memory Activities. And there's loads of activities that can be adapted in that for working with any language that comes up in class, whether it target or emergent. But one of the activities, there's a lot of activities in dialogue activities by Nick as well, another book by Nick, which I've used before because when you're getting learners to interact meaningfully, language is going to emerge. Yeah, whether it's at the lower level of things where you're helping students be more comprehensible and clear, or whether it's the higher level thing where you're providing alternatives, etc. So I think the key thing for me to make it stick, I'd say, is you can do all the traditional things that you'd normally do. First of all, clarifying the language within the context, whichever means that you use for that. It could be translation, or it could be the kind of CELTRI concept questions that you might use, and then obviously doing some work on form, simple elicitation of form to make it clear, but also some practice of that form, so some memory work with that form, because that's, as I say, I was finding that difficult today with the hand, the art. What I need practice with that form to be able to get a clearer grip on it in my memory. So I'd say that's what's really key. Some drilling work. Getting students to pronounce things. It doesn't have to be choral drilling. It can be working in pairs, testing each other, helping each other with it. It could be any kind of games that you have in order to kind of get the earworm effect of the language working. But it does need revisiting. I think the revisitation of it in class, and I mean Katie Kelly, a colleague of mine who works in Spain. Do you know Katie, Jamie?
Katie Kelly, I think.
Katie Kelly. She does a lot. Brilliant trainer, teacher, and trainer who works with younger learners, especially. And we interviewed her for the book as well in terms of what she does with emergent language and younger learners. And she had the phrase which I loved, which was emergence and then resurgence. So that language emerges, but we need to it needs a resurgence in order for it to start working. So I would do things like create lexical cards, or cards with whatever language we've been working on, and we'd do some testing each other with these cards next day. At the end of the week, I often put them all down on the floor and get the learners to go off and pick a few. They take the time, they go back, they do activities with each other. So I think the recycling, it's really important. And in one of the chapters in the book, we look at a list of activities that you can use to recycle emergent language when it comes up, because once it's come up, it does need to be revisited, because that is the language learning process. Even though it might be interesting to them in the moment, they might be ready to notice it. So we take the psycholinguistics of it, might be ready to notice it. Practice is necessary if we take that view that you don't always just learn things like that. Sometimes you do, don't you? Sometimes things just stick, but the majority of the time we need to work on them.
Yes, I think we've got to maybe have our own kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, expectations. I mean, we all know how frustrating it can be when the grammar doesn't stick. But that's the nature of language learning. That's
process, isn't it? It's not a product.
Yes.
And emergent language is a process of looking at language learning as a process, and it's the natural processes in language learning as opposed to the kind of the more artificial ones where we impose grammar syllabuses on them. That's the idea, but obviously it's a continuum.
Absolutely. But I would echo what you're saying as well, Richard. You've mentioned the teacher's voice twice now, I think, as a sort of tool. And I mean, that's, as well as multiple meetings, I would say that there's so much for me when I think of making language sticking. I think about the teacher's voice. We talk about dictation here, maybe translation as I did, but I mean, if you've not got the time for that at the start of a class, this is going to be quite engaging for your students, because the language came from them in the first place. It's just stand there with the paper and say, listen to me, you've had your haircut. Who said that? You've had your haircut. You have had your haircut. You've had your haircut. Find the rhythm. Give the space for students to actually hear it. The Guggenheim Museum looks like an airport. And give students space to let those sounds echo. This is all very short term, of course.
But getting them to play with it helps memory, though, Jamie. You're right, and you're a model in there. And whatever model you've got of English and whatever's relevant for the context is important, I think. And I spend a lot of time doing that in class in general.
Yes. But the main way to answer that question, Nick, who asked the question, how do you make emergent linguistic, is read your own books, Nick. I think that's what I took away.
Did it sound like that? Sorry, Nick.
I think that's a very good answer.
Yeah. Are you testing me?
And Evelina says, "Is my eyesight's going bad?" Yes. Oh, look, my bald patch. We were just before
comparing bald patches.
We were actually comparing bald patches before. I mean, I look like my
hair's a bit longer, didn't you?
I think you're about 10 years behind me, but
I think it might be more like 5. I think, I'm not sure.
No, I don't know. I think I've got about 10 years on you, Richard. So it should be about 10 years. But the great thing about going bald there is nobody notices until you do this.
Yeah. You've got to make sure you sit up. No.
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't have looked down like that. I've learned for the next time. But Evelina says, "Hello there. Thank you for bringing up this topic. What you do in class, you write on a chat things that a student says during a discussion. Pictionary is a great thing. That's another thing. Drawing these and then using the drawings later on to retrieve them.
Yeah.
That's a nice idea, Evelina. Yeah. Yes. Great. I realize we're getting on a bit, and it's almost time for your dinner, isn't it, Richard?
Yeah.
What are you having for your dinner?
Well, I've had dinner. It's beer o'clock, I think, and I've got a friend coming around to join me for a couple of beers, and then an early night and an early start tomorrow.
And what kind of beer will it be?
Oh, just lager. I'm really not. I'm not really a connoisseur. I'm a very cheap date, really.
Will it be an emergent lager?
Well, I'd left it in the fridge.
I'm going to have an emergent
randomly
dinner
pick things out. It's not all emergent. I mean, a lot of it is, but it's not all emergent.
I'm having an emergent stir fry tonight.
Are you? Yes. Well,
yeah.
Do you know what you're putting in? You don't know what you're putting in it yet. No.
Not yet. Just see what comes out. Comes up.
You're going to take a video. You're going to take a video of it, so you can go back and reflect on. I shouldn't have put the that half a can of lager into my stir fry.
Exactly. The last question I have: what do you think of the I spent a lot of time designing my cover slides, and I wanted to get this little shrubling or shoot or whatever you want to call it, seedling in there, just as per your book. What do you think of my cover slide?
I love it, actually. I think it's great. You've made me look more glamorous than I do clearly in real life.
Well, I wanted to show you one of the earlier iterations of this cover. I was playing around with it, and I ended not going with the one I'm going to show you. But I have to show it to you.
Feeling where this is going. Oh, it's not what I was thinking. This picture of me, you and Ben very late in the evening in where was it, in Uruguay, in Montevideo. I quite like this one. We should have gone with that for the front cover of the book. I think even Danny would have been happy with that. We could have had both of us on the front cover.
It's like this language, the metaphor of the shoot emerging from your nose. And I don't know if you've watched HBO's new series called The Last of Us, which
I love
is
it.
about.
I just finished it last night.
This is my inspiration.
Yes. Yeah.
This is incredible, Richard. I finished it last night too. We also had haircuts just 3 days ago. We discovered that we were chatting earlier on before when we were comparing bald patches. It's like we would be sinking if we were. I'm not going to finish that sentence. And I'm going to remove that seedling from your person.
Thank you.
And I'm going to let you have the last word.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come on and talk to you. And the book's available. Sorry, got to plug it. At Pavilion, you can order it online if you're in the UK. It is on Amazon, and there's an electronic copy that will be more readily available for people that don't want to use Amazon or that are sort of in other places other than the UK. So do get in touch if you've got any interesting emergent language stories. We'd really like to hear them. And thanks very much for inviting me, Jamie.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for doing this. It's lovely to hang out with you. It's just like, you know, the old days, and we're going to do it again very soon.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
And thank you to everybody for spending this hour with us. It's lovely to have you here, and I hope to see you at the next one. Probably next Thursday. I'll let you all know. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. You have a great night. Have a great dinner, and see you very soon. All right. Bye-bye. And broadcast.